we're going to cover basically TCP and UDP, and we're going to do it with an eye on how they make your application work on the network. There are two layer 4 protocols that transfer information on IP networks: TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, and UDP, User Datagram Protocol. Datagram is an old-fashioned term for a one-way short message which isn't acknowledged. TCP is complex. It's the most important of the two protocols, mainly because it's the most heavily used. There have been statistical reports that say 90% of the traffic that's in corporate networks and on the internet is based on TCP. UDP tends to be used for special purpose things like video conferencing and voice. Then we're going to move on to ports and their use. Ports basically are application addresses. They are a form of addressing. They're not very well understood, but they are the means by which we recognize the traffic of an application. They're also important when you're discussing the role of the firewall. So we'll look at some different forms of IP video: Mpeg Transport, RTP, RTSP, adaptive HTTP, so-called dash video. But we're only going to look at them in terms of how they use TCP and UDP to get a feeling for what they're going to do when they get on the network, because they will behave very much differently. So why is it important for AV professionals to understand these two protocols? More than any other single fact, whether the audio or video traffic is TCP or UDP tells us a great deal of how they're going to use the corporate or the network that you've built. This can be extremely important to you and to the IT department. You'll quickly see the difference in these two protocols in the next few slides. When your audio or video doesn't play out properly, you'll want to know if it's the network or some problem with the source or destination decoder. Understanding TCP and UDP can help in the process of narrowing down on the cause of the problem. One TCP flow can interrupt another. A TCP flow can slow abnormally due to network conditions, or an older version of TCP can impede the ability of a newer version of TCP performance. Finally, the lack of understanding of TCP is not unique in the AV industry. It's very much universal. Even experienced IT network administrators sometimes are surprised when they discover the complexity of the protocol, the many variations in which it is implemented, and the poor quality of troubleshooting tools that are available to help us in understanding how TCP works. So that's where our focus will be first. So where are TCP and UDP? Well, they sit at layer 4. So essentially, if you were in the previous workshop where we talked about the layering of the protocol stack, then you heard me mention that messages typically are created in the application, and as they go to the network, they go down through the protocol stack. So it works kind of like this. The application, say it's a web server, creates a chunk of data that may represent part of a home page, and it wants it sent. So it sends it down to layer 4. Layer 4, either TCP or UDP, in this case it would be TCP, puts a header in front of it. It's got port numbers in it, it has some synchronization values, all sorts of little codes. And that combination of the layer 4 header and the data is handed down to layer 3. Layer 3 adds the IP header, which puts in the source and destination IP addresses, puts in a value called hop count, and puts some other values in, like quality of service values, that is, precedence values, and that's called an IP packet, and that's handed down to layer 2, where the Ethernet card adds the destination NIC address and the source NIC address, the two hardware addresses of the two cards that are going to send and receive this, and that combined packet sent out on the network. So TCP and UDP sit at layer 4 of what's referred to as the protocol stack. If we compare UDP and TCP at a very high level, we can see some important differences. Why would an application developer choose one of these protocols over the other? Well, first, TCP is a protocol that negotiates a formal session with its partner. TCP will also adjust its send rate according to its estimate of the network's ability to carry the data. It estimates bandwidth, loss, and latency, and if those have deteriorated, it will reduce the flow rate. If they've, again, improved, it will increase the flow rate. TCP guarantees delivery. It's also designed to fill the pipe to the capacity with limited ability to be fair to the other flows. Listen to that again. It fills the capacity of the pipe with limited ability to be fair to other flows. And it assumes that IP is sending and receiving on its behalf. UDP, on the other hand, is what I refer to as a simple protocol or a dumb protocol. It sends to a partner UDP, but it doesn't interact with that partner. It has no idea whether or not the data arrives successfully, and it assumes that IP sends it and receives it on its behalf. But it's kind of unaware of what's going on in the network and with the receiver. Looking a little bit closer at TCP and UDP, TCP negotiates. It negotiates the maximum amount of data that's going to be sent in each packet. TCP sends data and expects an acknowledgement. If a data packet is lost, it will retransmit, but it may retransmit it eventually, and you'll see that in a demonstration we're going to do. TCP announces how much incoming data it can store, and that's in a window value. That window value, by the way, has been fairly controversial, and it's changed over time and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger as our systems get faster. But most important, TCP is not aware of other flows, and it will use as much of the bandwidth as it estimates is available. It behaves as if it has control of the link, and it will use as much of the link as it possibly can. Now, looking at UDP, UDP sends as soon as the application says send it, and the operating says you have permission to do it. It has absolutely no knowledge of receipt or failure of receipt, so they're quite different protocols. So what uses these two protocols? Well, let's look first at TCP. Adaptive video is initiated by a browser, and because it is initiated by a browser, it runs over HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP, in turn, runs over TCP. So adaptive video is always running over TCP. A client player requests a video using HTTP/TCP. The video is delivered in chunks based on a trigger set by the amount of playout buffer that's been depleted. If network conditions improve or degrade, the quality of the chunk requested is adjusted upward or downward. Video on demand operates very much like a file transfer, and it's a TCP process. Progressive video and download and play video use HTTP, the web protocol, and TCP. Now, surveillance video is a little unusual because surveillance video uses RTSP, that's real-time streaming protocol, and some forms of it use TCP, and you see over in the other column, some forms of it use UDP. On the UDP side, almost always video conferencing is done with UDP. Voice over IP is by far the most widely used UDP application. And IPTV, we'll talk about later, and some audio applications also use UDP. So now let's turn to the operation of TCP to see how it works. First thing that happens is, remember this is a formal relationship that's established. When TCP wishes to establish a connection with TCP/B, it sends a packet called a SYN packet. You can see that going to the right. Within this packet are codes indicating operating parameters A would like to use. If B can abide by those parameters and has the storage, processing capability, and so forth, it will return a packet that's also marked as a SYN packet, but also marked as an ACK packet, acknowledge. SYN is short for synchronization, ACK is short for acknowledgement. And if it contains the same parameters, then basically it's indicating it's accepting the conditions. Finally, A binds the relationship by sending an ACK back to B. This process is widely called the three-way handshake, and it happens in every single TCP session. When you use a packet sniffer, you can always see a session starting by seeing the SYN-ACK, ACK as they call it. Now, Neil's going to help me demonstrate the typical TCP process. Okay, Neil?
I'm ready.
In this demo, I'll be the server that's been asked to transfer a file. Neil will be the client that is expecting to receive the file. So I say, here's segment 1 and segment 2.
I'm looking for segment number 3.
Well, here's segment 3, 4, 5, and 6.
I'm looking for segment number 7.
And here's segments 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12.
I'm looking for segment number 13.
And so the process continues. Thanks, Neil. Notice that the sender increases the amount of data that's sent with each successful acknowledgement. This basic form of exchange continues until all the data is transferred. Then typically, at the end, it indicates the finish of the session, and the session is closed with what's sometimes referred to as a four-way handshake. It's important that that takes place because the operating system has to recover all the resources it used for the session, such as storage space and timers and things like that. We're going to look at how TCP works when it has robust and error-free network. Later, we'll deal with how errors are handled. The initial stage of the session is called slow start. The idea is to gradually send more and more data until the link becomes saturated. You can see here it sends some data, and just as Neil and I demonstrated, increases the amount it sends and increases the amount that it sends. What is shown here is a gradual increase in the flow until the link seems to become filled. In the next phase, called congestion avoidance, the rate at which the increase is taking place slows. The idea is that it wants to try to avoid congestion, and so it gradually increases after a rather accelerated start. The sending TCP assumes that it's near to overwhelming the receiver and wisely slows its transmission rate. Finally, it arrives at the point where the transmitting station adjusts to the rate that the receiver can comfortably process the data and the network can comfortably carry it. This is called steady state. But what's going to happen if packets are dropped? And there will be packets dropped. That's part of the design, as I'll explain. TCP starts its slow start process and sends more data. At some point, either the network buffers overfill or the receiver gets more incoming data than it can buffer, and a packet is dropped. The dropped packet will not be acknowledged, so TCP-A assumes it sent the data too quickly and it cuts its sending rate. Then it starts slow start all over again. But if a second packet is dropped, the rate's cut again. Note that the network buffers can be overfilling because of other traffic such as IPTV or a system backup or YouTube or whatever. If the drop packets are excessive, the rate will continually drop until only a single packet at a time is being sent and a single ACK is being received back for it. However, if the drop packets are only a result of network and receiver buffer overfill, the transmission rate will adjust to the proper level that both the network and the receiver are able to handle. In other words, it will reach steady state. What's critical to understand here is that dropped packets are the way the TCP sender is told to adjust its transmission rate back. Dropped packets are very much part of normal operation. It's not critical at all to eliminate all dropped packets when you're transmitting TCP. This idea certainly isn't very well understood widely. Now again, we're going to do a demo of how this takes place when packets are dropped. So the first thing that happens is that the three-way handshake between Neil and Phil takes place, the SYN, ACK, and ACK. Now we negotiated the conditions for a transmission. I'm going to be the server. Neil's going to be the client that's expecting to receive a file. In this scenario, keep this in mind, in this scenario, it's segment number 6, which the network drops. So here's how we start. Here's segment 1 and 2.
I'm looking for segment number 3.
Well, here's segment 3, 4, 5, and 6.
I'm looking for segment number 6.
Here's segment 7.
I'm looking for segment number 6.
Well, here's segment number 8.
I'm looking for segment number 6.
Here's segment 9.
I'm looking for segment number 6.
At this point, the client has sent 4 acknowledgments requesting 6. And the TCP in the server may now assume that that packet is lost. Otherwise, the assumption is it might have been out in the network misrouted or something like that. So once it assumes that that packet was lost, data packet segment 6 is sent, and Neil says,
I'm looking for segment number 10.
And with that, we send segment number 10. Now, the important thing to notice here is that a single dropped packet caused the slow start process and the congestion avoidance process to not allow the increase in traffic flow. It dropped back to a single packet at a time. So rather than, for example, in this duration, getting 12, 15, or 20 packets through, we might end up getting 5 or 6 or 7 packets through. One single packet lost could cut our throughput rate by as high as 50%. So here's the bottom line on TCP. It's significantly affected by dropped packets, as we just saw. It also estimates the latency and will decrease the transmit rate if it thinks the travel time to the receiver is high. Finally, it constantly estimates the amount of available bandwidth, and it adjusts its sending rate to use just that amount. If the bandwidth is being consumed by another process, such as IPTV, TCP will adjust downward. TCP also accelerates the rate it's sending based on successful acknowledgments of data. But if the data is detected to be lost, it reverses and slows. Then there's the hidden but very important message here. If your AV video or audio flow is demanding bandwidth from the IT network, you will be the cause of some business application slowdowns. It's unavoidable. That's part of the reason why it's important to separate this kind of traffic on separate VLANs to eliminate that possibility. So how does UDP work? Quite simply, all of the considerations we just studied with the rate of flow, area resiliency, estimating the receiver's capacity, those are all pushed up to the application. UDP only does 3 things. UDP identifies the sending and receiving process using port numbers. It runs an error check on the UDP header, and it records the length of the data. Notice, no SYN, no ACK, no windows, no sequencing, no indication of loss, or anything that TCP does. That's why I call it a dumb protocol. In voice and video conferencing, some of the TCP features are added back in by inserting the protocol called real-time protocol, RTP. If we put the RTP header in with UDP, RTP will add sequence numbers and some timestamps and an identifier of the audio or video source, and it will also allow for a protocol called Are Tcp to report loss. Notice what's happening is that secondary protocols, RTP and RTCP, are being used to add some of the features that TCP automatically incorporates. So for example, RTP became very popular in the early 2000 period with voice over IP. Voice over IP is a classic RTP UDP application. In a typical flow of audio from A to B, the codec digitizes 10 milliseconds of sound and records that in 80 bytes. It places 2 of these samples, 20 milliseconds of sound, in an IP UDP RTP packet. That is, the structure of the packet's IP, UDP, RTP. And it sends it to the network. Hence, the voice packets from A to B flow at 50 per second. In video conferencing, the process is similar, except that these packets are filled with compressed video, which may vary in quality depending on the contents of the video frame. As you probably know, the frames are typically being recorded and played out at 15, 30, or 60 frames per second. Today, video compression is very good. However, it still requires many, many packets to represent a single frame, especially if the motion is complex that's in the scene. So the bottom line with UDP is this. UDP can be very sensitive to loss. In voice, if several successive packets are lost, audio drops momentarily, and we notice it. By the way, a lot of people believe that if you lose a single packet, there will be a detectable loss, but that's not true. It's a 50th of a second of sound, and your ear just isn't that sensitive. It takes a couple of packets in succession being lost before you detect it. But in video, because so many video packets are necessary to paint a single frame, the quality may be reduced or toweling may become apparent. Little squares or little slices on the screen that turn to a different color because the data didn't come in order to paint it properly. This is Phil's own rule of thumb. If you're using UDP in an application, especially a real-time application like voice and video, don't let the loss level in the network get above 1/4%. And again, that's only a kind of rule of thumb. If it gets up to 0.5%, you will certainly see significant indications of deterioration. And even with video, it's probably the case that it should be lower than that. But 1 packet out of 400 being dropped is probably about the limit to what you would be able to tolerate with a UDP application like voice or video conferencing. So now it's quiz time. So what we're going to look at here, and then I'll give you a minute or two to think about this and see what you can come up with and maybe jot an answer down on a piece of paper, and then we'll talk about it. We have a connection that has 100 megabits per second of bandwidth available on a constant basis. In other words, it's not wireless, which fluctuates up and down. This is what's going through the connection. We have a video conference session using relatively constant 5 megabits per second. That's the total for both ways. We have a voice over IP session that's using 250 kilobits per second, which would be fairly typical, the total for both ways. There's a 20 gigabit file server backup going through the connection. And there's an adaptive video transfer in standard definition like Netflix, which is averaging around 3 megabits per second. The problem is to estimate what happens to the other 3 flows if each one of these flows is momentarily stopped. In other words, for example, what happens if the video conferencing flow is taken away? What happens to the file backup flow, the voice over IP flow, the adaptive video flow? And then what happens if you take out the file transfer flow? What happens to the other 3? So I'll give you a minute or two to think about it, and then we'll talk about what the answer is. We need Vanna White's music in the background here, Neil.
Crap. Wish I had thought of that.
I don't do this in my college classes, but the hint is to think, which ones are TCP and which ones are UDP? Okay, let's take out the video conferencing. Now the video conferencing went away, so we just picked up 5 megabits per second. We've got a file backup taking place. We have voice over IP and adaptive video. Well, the answer is the voice over IP won't be affected at all. In that case, it's a UDP application, and it's going to operate at the rate at which the application demands, which is 50 packets per second. That doesn't change. But the file backup is TCP based. And because there's more bandwidth available, it will actually speed up. The throughput will increase. The adaptive video will also have more bandwidth available, but it's going into a playout buffer. So the thing that will happen there is the playout buffer will fill more quickly. So let's put the video conferencing back in. Let's take out the file backup. Now we don't have that big file backup taking place. The file backup was TCP. Take that away, and there's no impact on the voice again. And the impact on the video conference is probably not going to be affected, except if video conference is based on scalable video coding, which is adaptive. If it's based on scalable video coding, then the quality may improve. The adaptive video will also, again, more quickly fill the buffer because more bandwidth is available. Now, if we take away the VoIP, it's such a small amount, it probably has a minimal effect on anything. But certainly it will have a minor effect on the file transfer and a minor effect on the adaptive video. And finally, if we take out the adaptive video transfer, which by the way would happen because as you'll see later, the video is downloaded in chunks anyways, when you take it away, same thing. The file backup improves, video conference and the VoIP are not affected. So here's a layer 4 summary. TCP interacts with the receiving TCP and adapts to network conditions. If the network is slow or error prone, decreased throughput will result. UDP, on the other hand, it does what the application commands and simply provides the addressing necessary to get the data to its partner. So let's turn our attention now to ports. Ports are decimal numbers that identify the application processes. Both clients and servers use a port number. Both TCP and UDP use ports. Ports from 1 to 120 to 1023, that's from 1 to 1023, are called well-known because the entire Internet community agrees on their use. For example, 25 is a port identifying simple mail transfer protocol. Port 80 identifies HTTP. If a process uses it for any other purpose, it's likely an indication of malware behavior, a virus or a worm. In a client-server session, it's the server that uses the well-known port. It's the server that uses the well-known port. The client picks a random port that's based on what the operating tells it to use. For example, if a browser in Windows XP is in a session downloading your company's homepage, the client will probably use port number like 2026, but your web server will definitely be using port 80. So if you visualize a port, one way to do it is to think of it as an entry point into the application from TCP. That's appropriate because a mail server using 25 knows it's sending and receiving email-related things to TCP, but the port 80 identifies in the data packet that something is being sent to or from a web application. Here are some well-known ports. By the way, well-known ports are registered with the Internet Assigned Number Authority. HTTP, the web protocol, uses 80. Sending email uses 25. Receiving uses 110 if you're doing POP email. RTSP and surveillance cameras use 540. SSL, the secure protocol that's used in HTTPS, uses 443. And Telnet uses 23. FTP actually uses 2 ports, 20 and 21. But here's a tricky one. RTP and voice and video conferencing very often uses a range of ports from, for example, 50,500 to 50,600. So we can also think of a port as the connection point at the client or the server. Here you've got port 2016 in the client in a session with port 25 on the server. In this case, what would be happening probably is that email is being sent. Where is the port in the data packet? Well, the port's normally stored in the first 2 fields of the layer 4 header, called the source port and the destination port. Some of you were in the last webinar and you were dragged through binary. So here's a binary related question. If these first 2 fields that store the port numbers are 16 bits long, what's the highest port number that can be stored? If you have an idea, send a chat to Neil.
Keeping an eye on it.
The field's 16 bits long. So how many things can you represent 16 bits? Well, it's 65,536. 64K. That is 64 times 1,024. So what do ports have to do with the firewall? The primary purpose of a firewall is to filter traffic, block bad packets, and accept good packets. Firewalls normally sit between a trusted network and an untrusted network. These could be, for example, your corporate network, which you trust, and the internet that you don't trust. Nearly all firewalls use this rule by default. Block traffic from the untrusted network passing to the trusted network, and allow all traffic passing from the trusted network to the untrusted network. Essentially, in a corporate setting, block traffic from the internet by default and allow traffic going to the internet. Generally, this means blocking incoming traffic and allowing outgoing traffic. As a result, a device in the internet trying to do a 3-way handshake with your email will be blocked unless there's an exception made on port 25. So traffic coming in must be allowed by an access rule. There would be something in the firewall similar to allow port 25 to pass to 192.23.45.78 or whatever the address of the email server is. Because HTTP web traffic is almost always allowed. Port 80 is very rarely blocked. That single fact is why adaptive video is so popular. What this means to audio and video transport. Audio and video transfers using a browser on HTTP or HTTPS using port 80 or 443 is almost never blocked. Surveillance or other camera output using RTSP will be on port 540, and generally it will be blocked. So you probably have to talk to IT about getting that through the firewall. Video conferencing and IPTV use RTP generally, and they use a range of ports, and that's kind of problematic. I'm saying problematic to be nice here, but often it's a nightmare. So getting through video conferencing through a firewall or getting IPTV through a firewall will depend very much on working with the people who understand exactly how the firewall is configured and what you have to do to get it through. There are protocols which will facilitate it, but you should be aware that that can be a problem. So let's take a look at some of these different forms of video. Understanding how a particular form of video behaves on an IP network is best revealed by studying its packet structure. If you were in the first workshop we did, I mentioned that there, and I'll probably mention it every time I talk to you, because I was taught very, very early in my career, 25 years ago in my career, that what's in the packet will reveal what you can do with the protocol and how it's going to behave on the network. So in almost every case here, I'm going to show you the packet structure. So let's look at video conferencing, but not video conferencing using WebRTC, which is a new form and is quite different than this. We're talking about what I would call conventional video conferencing. Video conferencing involves two kinds of flows. A control flow, which uses something like H323 or Cisco Skinny protocol, and the actual audio-video flow, nearly always using RTP and UDP. So the control session is almost always a TCP flow. So you'll see a three-way handshake, you'll see an AX, you'll see everything that TCP does. Within that flow, the ports that are going to be used for the RTP and UDP will be generally selected and announced. If you learn to use a sniffer and dig into the packets, you should be able to see the ports that are being used. This is, of course, assuming the control session isn't using SSL to securely encrypt the control flow. There's also a UDP RTP flow each way, so altogether 4 ports will be used. RTP carries sequencing and timing data, so there are special protocols that IT can use to help you get the packets through a firewall. The flow is based on UDP, not TCP. So what does that tell us about the impact of packet loss? It's a UDP flow, not a TCP flow. So what do we know about packet loss? We know that the video conference will be degraded by even a minimal amount of packet loss. WebRTC is browser-to-browser video conferencing. And because it is browser-to-browser, it's going to use port 80 or port 443. That's why it's popular. It zips right through the firewall. But it also means because it's using port 80 or 443, it's either HTTP or SSL, the standard web browsing protocols. So it's going to behave like web browsing traffic, which means it'll be TCP based. And it will be impacted by loss by either degrading the quality or increasing the delay and cutting down the amount of bandwidth that's available, which in turn will probably cut the quality. So the important thing to keep in mind here is WebRTC is really going to look very, very much like HTTP traffic, like standard web browsing traffic. Now, one that's real important in the AV industry is called Mpeg Transport Protocol, or Mpeg Transport System. It's sometimes abbreviated MPTS or MP2TS because it came from MPEG-2. Please do not confuse MPEG-2 transport with MPEG-2 compression. They're different things. MPEG-2 transport is a format we use to transfer video. It makes use of UDP and optionally RTP. Turns out, in almost all cases that I've experienced, it will use UDP and RTP in an enterprise application like a hospital, but a carrier will not use RTP. The RTP is not really necessary because everything that you need to do the sequencing and the timing is built into the Mpeg Transport packets that are in here. Data is transferred in blocks of 188 bytes that contain the audio or the video or control. So in this picture here, if you look down here, we've got a standard TCP/IP packet, Ethernet, IP, UDP, RTP, which is optional, and 7 little 188 byte packets. Because there are 7 of those packets that are exactly 188 bytes long, we know exactly how many bytes can be carried by a single packet. But in Mpeg Transport transmission of video, a single frame of video could be stored in hundreds or thousands of small Mpeg packets. So it will result in lots and lots and lots of IP packets being transferred. In the 4th session in this series, we're going to look into Mpeg Transport in a great amount of detail because it's widely used in digital signage, it's used in some audio applications, it's used in IPTV. Mpeg Transport, so-called IPTV, Mpeg Transport is very, very widely applied. So let's take a look at streaming video. Streaming video, so-called DASH-like video. DASH stands for Dynamic Adaptive Streaming over HTTP. I would like to tell you here a little experience I've had recently. I was sitting on a TIA committee that was building an IP emulation of a network carrying IP video. And right in the middle of our research, Netflix hit. And it was such a phenomenon that the committee stopped and started to study how it worked. And we've spent around 3 years studying how DASH-type video works. But this is video streamed from a server that uses HTTP. DASH is a group that decided to try to standardize it so there would be one standard to follow instead of following the 3 popular forms of adaptive video that came from Flash, Adobe Flash, Microsoft Smooth Streaming, and Apple's HTTP, Apple HLS. The server stores several forms of the movie in different resolutions, frame rates, and formats. And what happens is that they are transferred according to the ability of the network basically to carry the traffic. So DASH works something like this. First thing that happens when you go, say, to Netflix is that you authenticate your device or you authenticate your software to the server. If the server accepts your authentication, the server sends a manifest down to you. The manifest basically gives you things like, here are the quality levels that are available, and here are the addresses in the CDN, the Content Delivery Network, you can go to get this. The manifest is basically a small, what amounts to like an Excel spreadsheet that gives you the possibilities that are available. The client decides which one it wants, and it sends a standard web HTTP GET request, and then asks for a certain level or certain profile video and a certain number of bytes of the video, say 1 million bytes. That first chunk of data is delivered in a series of HTTP data flows. You'll see literally sometimes thousands and thousands of packets that are HTTP carrying that video down, all running over TCP. When that chunk is complete, when the playout buffer gets depleted far enough that the player decides, gee, I need some more video, it'll send an HTTP GET and it'll say something like, I want the next 1 million bytes, and probably in the same resolution that I got the first 1 million because they successfully played out. And the next chunk of video, the next 1 million bytes or so. Typically, by the way, the size of these chunks are usually around 10 seconds, and that begins to play out. Now suppose the network deteriorates during that playout. The server is going to figure out the network deteriorated, and this time when it goes to send the next chunk, it's going to decrease the quality of the video in order to take up less bandwidth, in order to be able to overcome any errors that take place, because they can be retransmitted within the time allowed. This is TCP. And then if the network improves, the higher quality of the transfer will be sent down to the client. So here's my last little quiz question. How does the server detect that the network deteriorated? How does the server know that the network deteriorated? Is there something explicit that the client sends to the server? If you picked up bits and pieces of what I've said, what's important here is this is TCP behavior. So if the network deteriorates, if there's loss in the network or increased latency in the network, It's TCP's algorithm which will say to the server, you have a poor quality network, you have less bandwidth, you have higher latency. And the application can look at the TCP connection and say, it's not as good of a connection, so I have to decrease the amount of traffic that I'm sending down to the client. So that's how adaptive video works. Dynamic adaptive streaming over HTTP operates on the basis of TCP's ability to detect the quality of the network.